a lot of times when these kind of search databases like the Google Analytics database are accidentally released in some way, shape, or form, or otherwise leaked, a lot of times they figure out identities by triangulating in terms of all the people close to me. So you definitely have to post a privacy policy. And the key thing that Google mandates in their legal terms is that you're explicit that you're using a tracking cookie. I would be explicit that I'm using Google's tracking cookie to track user activity. And this brings up all kinds of other things that I think of in terms of privacy policies in the MSU environment. If I have login and I've integrated with Sentinel or Shibboleth, I probably should be explaining that I probably, if I'm a web application, have 3 cookies. I have the login.msu.edu cookie and possibly other cookies behind the scenes for Shibboleth and Sentinel. I probably have a session cookie for my own web application, and if I embed Google Analytics, I have another cookie. And probably all of those should be mentioned in the privacy policy, as well as including the pertinent information about how to trash session cookies and login cookies and single sign-on cookies, and how to linking to the Google privacy policy, linking to Google's pages on how to block their tracking cookies and opt out, essentially, from internet surveillance by Google. And one of the most resounding things, both in the Google agreement and under MSU policies, it really matters to both MSU and to Google that you're doing this on behalf of a third party, the third party in this case being MSU. So it matters that you're committing the institution to a legal contract. That's what general counsel gets wrinkled about. I don't think any of us in this room have authority to bind the institution to a contract. That being said, we've been reminded repeatedly that if we go ahead and click through on one of these things, at the end of the day, a court probably will bind the institution to the agreement. So you're exceeding your authority as delegated by the institution and by the Board of Trustees if you go ahead and do this. So if your boss asks you to agree to one of these agreements, I would pause and maybe think about the implications of your actions. Hopefully we can get something like we have for Google Apps for Education, where it's deemed okay for us to agree to this agreement. And specific authority for this agreement is delegated to web developers in some way, shape, or form. And I will be following up, I'm sure, with the listserv at some point about this. These are the privacy settings that you would be agreeing to. You notice right at the top of the screen, if you can read the tiny text, it says, yes, I agree to the above terms and conditions. I left out the legal agreement. You can really easily find it by going to google.com/analytics, and right at the bottom there's a terms of service. That is the specific terms of service that are listed above here. They're different by country, so they're actually a little bit more restrictive in some other countries. They do a bit of hand waving in the United States, oddly enough. I'm not sure why. I think my recommendation would be, if you don't need to, click the Do Not Share My Google Analytics Data. The first one you have to enable if you're going to use AdWords or one of the other services in conjunction with Google Analytics. If you're not using one of the other services, I don't see any reason to leave that box checked. So our recommendation would be uncheck that box. The anonymously share data with Google and others is for benchmarking purposes. So as part of analytics, you get a benchmarking report of your site versus other sites deemed to be similar by the software algorithm in some way, shape, or form. I have no idea how that could possibly be pertinent for most of our sites, being as a lot of us run sites that are subunits of a really large, complex organization. We're not running a t-shirt store, which is relatively easy for a computer to benchmark and identify similar sites. So I'm not sure there's a lot of value in sharing this data either. I think unchecking it allows you to still get some benchmarking data. Your benchmarking data won't be as good, the reports that you get. And certainly there's something of a community effect here. They're trying to strong arm all developers into checking this box and leaving it checked so that they get good data, so they can provide good data to all of us. On an institutional site, I don't feel a lot of citizenship requirements to check that. I would probably uncheck it on our sites. So I kind of covered most of this. Query string parameters, I think, are a big thing. Those are captured as part of this kind of thing. Captured in the current log analysis you do if you do it locally. I'd say check things that are personally identifiable for anyone browsing the web on your site, and any other users of your site, and any data that you have behind the scenes of your site. I'm currently drafting an example privacy policy. I cruised around the MSU web space, and a bunch of you already have privacy policies, so kudos. A bunch of my sites don't, and a bunch of my sites do, so I'm kind of like half and half, I think. probably in this day and age, given the prevalence of cookies and other things like that, it's probably a good idea to have a privacy policy. Certainly relative to this, the cookies are really important. Your use of any kind of user profile or any other collection of personally identifiable information is probably pretty important to disclose and explain how it is or is not an issue relative to privacy. Use of the site by minors. COPPA's dead. Hopefully maybe someday next time we have a legal policy seminar, someone can explain to me what the current law is. I think in one of the Telecom Acts or something subsequently, they reinstated a bunch of those rules. The original COPPA Act was deemed unconstitutional for a variety of reasons, but that being said, there's still some kind of law that governs our use of websites with minors. How the data is shared, how you're going to use the reports or your analytics, I think is really important to disclose. Any limits you put on that. I think the blanket policy we should stick at the top of all of these is that we'll protect privacy to the extent allowable by law. I talked it over with Dave, and Dave suggested we not bring up anything specific like the Freedom of Information Act or anything else, because there's a bazillion laws that come into play with this. In the last 5 years, or 10 years, certainly since 9/11, there's been a whole bunch of new laws. The Patriot Act, for instance, the FBI has all kinds of rules now where they can do stuff without a court order. Obviously, court orders have a lot of power. Subpoenas have a lot of power. So beyond the Freedom of Information Act, there's just a whole bunch of other things that could come up that could cause us to have to expose much more information about our site traffic or our site users than we would naturally be inclined to. So to the extent allowable by law is a pretty good term. Any use of third-party widgets. So there's a bunch of stuff out there. If you embed them on your sites, there's a good chance you're already using Google Analytics through the use of that JavaScript or Ajax included tool. Probably disclosing who you're getting the tools from and what their privacy policies are is a good idea in your privacy policy. Any opt-in, opt-out, newsletters, listservs, those kind of things that pertain to your site. How you're going to update and publish modifications to the privacy policy. If your site includes things like I can send content to a friend, that should probably be included. Off-site linking to sites that maybe have a very drastically different privacy policy. And a general statement that you're going to try to keep your website secure and all this, that, and the other so that they're not exposed through the compromise of your server. And a lot of these are optional. Like I would rip these out of the privacy policy for most of our sites because they don't include a lot of these features. But so we're going to have probably a draft that looks like, here's some template language, these are probably required elements, and here's a bunch of miscellaneous grab bag stuff that you should select as needed based on the features of your site. Any questions?